Hello and welcome back to this damn fully idealistic crusade. Let's talk about the black bird, shall we? But of course, if you have one black bird, it's possible to get another. There's only one masterpiece version of the Maltese Falcon, in terms of the 1941 Landmark, directed by John Huston, which was the third Warner Brothers film version of Dashiell Hammett's masterpiece 1930 novel of the same name. So I thought it would be a good time to discuss those first two adaptations from 1931 and 1936 that have become real curiosities in terms of fans of hard-boiled detective fiction and film noir, and it's amazing we have the ability to look at these first two versions. But it also becomes quickly apparent when you watch these why the 1941 film immediately became the definitive version of the story, and how it very much overcame the obstacles that the first two adaptations ran into and avoided the same mistakes of those first two versions. But the two films are very much different approaches at tackling the same material, in terms of they are completely different in how they handle Dashiell Hammett's novel, and are also respective of which the period of when they were made at Warner Brothers, and reflect the different approaches of Warner, even though it's only a 5-year gap between the two. So to first talk about the 1931 film adaptation, which was directed by Roy Del Ruth and starring Ricardo Cortez as Sam Spade. This is a very much pre-code adaptation of the story, so it has quite a deal of Dashiell Hammett's grittiness, and most of his dialogue is here, because this film adaptation is actually, relatively doing the plot of the book. But what it does is it puts it in the Warner PreCode mold. So this is a very gritty, two-fisted of the streets, but with a sense of humor and vitality, and of course a great heaping dose of sexuality. This is a very pre-code film for all the reasons why we love pre-code Hollywood, and that becomes apparent from the opening frames of this film, where the Spade of this film, played by Cortez, is very much a just wonderfully charming lady killer of sorts. There is no tiptoeing around the fact that Spade in this film is very much a ladies' man, and apparently does quite well, because every woman in the film is practically throwing herself at him, which is obviously the most pre-code aspect of this particular film adaptation. But once you get past all of the sort of Warner's window dressing, if you will, of it being a 1931 Warner's pre-code film, you can recognize Dashiell Hammett's novel. I mean, this actually has all of the events of the book. We have Spade and Archer. We have the duplicitous Bridget O'Shaughnessy. We have our trio of iconic villains in Gutman, Cairo, and Wilmer. But what this film manages to pull out of Hammett's novel and replicate from Hammett's novel, it also doesn't have the same impact, and that's why this film, I think, frequently gets glossed over. It's a surprise that it manages to get as much of the book on the screen as it does. I mean, it pretty much does the book, but it doesn't have the same impact, so it honestly doesn't feel the same, because there's so much more put into the sort of charm of these characters living dangerously and being reckless and being sexually explicit and very sensual, and Cortez's Spade is always one wisecrack ahead of everyone else, but also playing the odds and being very much the private detective as a lady killer, and also apparently he does quite well at it, because his apartments and furnishings and all the clothes you see on display are very much above what you'd see a private detective eking out a living in the worst times of the Great Depression. So it does, you do have to look at it as obviously a Hollywood production as well. While there is grittiness, it gets dialed down by the fact that it's also trying to give some element of glamour to the proceedings for Depression audiences. Even though this obviously isn't MGM and it's still Warner's and it is gritty and it's still doing Hammett's book, there's also a disconnect there because there is some of the high life that's inherently there, and you start wondering, well, how the heck does Spade afford this apartment? For diehard fans of the Falcon, you'll notice that there are some tweaks in this story that actually do get reflected and picked up and reused in the next film version, particularly how in the opening Miles Archer is aware of the past affair between his wife and Sam Spade, and obviously has a displayed sense of jealousy about it in the opening sequence. That gets repeated in the remake in 1936 and is not part of the original novel, and of course is not in the 1941 version. And it's something that I think is one of these little tiny elements that, while it doesn't seem like it's something major, I think this element is one of the many that starts to pile up that actually makes Hammett's story in these two adaptations, I mean, it makes it feel a little bit more typical. It makes it feel more normal. And it also, I think, in some ways kind of cheapens the story. And I think that when you have multiple elements like this here in this first film, it detracts from the genius of Hammett's plotting, and it's also a bit of a distraction from the actual story. So I don't think it really adds anything, but I think the fact that you have multiple little instances like this, even though the film is pretty much doing the book as an adaptation, none of these were necessary. And there's also a slight jokiness in the tone of a lot of the scenes. So even when you have some of the most famous lines of dialogue from the book that are also in the 1941 film, here in the 1931 film, in some cases almost verbatim, none of them have the same impact, even when it's the same famous lines of dialogue that we all hear Humphrey Bogart as Spade saying in our head, and we all remember from reading Hammett's novel. Well, when you have them here in the film, or even some of the famous Gutman conversations with Spade, with some of the famous lines, they feel so weird that it takes you a second to realize, hey, wait, that's the iconic line. Even lines like, I won't play the sap for you, none of them have the same impact. However, when they do land, they have a different sort of energy. And it's really fascinating to see what Cortez does as Spade, because he's a great Spade in this iteration. I think Cortez is one of the most underrated actors of this period in Hollywood. There was seemingly nothing he couldn't handle, and it's a shame he never really reached that full peak level of stardom, because he really had the talent on display. And here he's the driving force of this film, and he's the one who really brings the energy for everyone else to play off of. And he manages to really dance between the sort of suave lady killer and then the hard private detective of the streets. And it's fascinating to see how he handles Hammett's situations being reflected in this film adaptation. And he's so good in this that you wish this was a direct adaptation, and you wish you could see him actually doing Spade as written. He would still probably have some of these notes in there, because this was the type of character he was known for playing, in terms of being the sort of suave, duplicitous lady killer with that wonderful sort of mischievous twinkle in the eye. But it would be fascinating to see him playing the direct Spade in terms of the way Hammett wrote him. But I think Cortez is the real standout of this film. Bebe Daniels plays the Bridget character, although for some reason in the first two film versions they dispense with all of the aliases, and they always just want to keep her as Miss Wonderly. So I guess that was just a means of trying to simplify things. And she makes for a great Bridget in terms of having all the different duplicitous layers and playing the affectations, and we can see how she has done this many times before, and how Spade isn't necessarily falling for it. But interestingly, in this film, we do have, like in the novel, them actually have a relationship. And although we don't see any sex on screen, it's very clear, just as it is in the novel, that they do sleep together at least once, if not several times in the film. So, of course, this being a full PreCode film where sex is very much on display and always omnipresent, it, of course, makes sense that this would be the film that actually has them sleep together as they do in the novel, which, of course, they couldn't do in the 1941 film. But that's one of the changes that actually makes the characters in the 1941 film more mythic, which is why I think the 1941 film is the definitive version of this story, and why it's part of why it's so magical. All the characters become more mythic in that film, whereas here in the 1931 film, even the villains feel much more normal, and that's, obviously going to add to realism, but they're not mythic. They don't live in the mind. The most impactful of the villains is actually Wilmer in this film version, because he's played by Dwight Frye, and as soon as he shows up, we all get excited, being classic horror fans, and he exudes an energy of menace, but unfortunately doesn't have any very much dialogue at all. He's barely in the film. For some reason, Wilmer is even more of a minor character in these two films than he is in the 1941 version. But Fry exudes such energy and menace. He makes for a perfect Wilmer, even though, it seems like he'll shoot literally everything in the scene because he's absolutely just a nutcase. But that's the energy that you need from Wilmer, and you get that radiated menace. But he's the most memorable of the villains, actually, because in our Gutman and Cairo in this film, while they still retain their names and the respective identity of their characters, they just feel normal, and they don't have that spark of energy. They don't have that mythic charm that makes them live in our heads. And obviously no one's ever going to compare to the cast of the 1941 film, but that's another aspect of the 1931 version that I again think does sort of normalize the story. And then because we have this sort of jokey tone that keeps popping up, it really undercuts a lot of the scenes. This even mars the ending of the film, which actually has some potency to it, and does actually maintain Hammett's ending for the most part, which you would think they weren't going to do, because it's a breezier retelling of Hammett's novel. So it's a surprise that they do retain Hammett's ending, but then they just sort of mar it by an end gag that doesn't really fit, and again sort of harkens back to this jokey tone that undercuts a lot of the drama when it pops up in the film. It's essential to have some humor and some levity, but as we'll see in the 1936 version, if you let it go too far, it's going to wreck everything. And John Huston brilliantly realized that you had to hone in on the humor and make it believable, but make it lived in and never let it overwhelm anything. That's why the 1941 version manages to have humor, but it keeps it in check. It never lets it overwhelm anything. And because it's kept in check, it feeds into the more mythic status of the characters in that version. And the humor is in Hammett's novel, but it's very dry. And so that's another unique aspect of the 1941 version. So ultimately, when you look at the 1931 version of the Maltese Falcon, this is a surprisingly good adaptation for this period of early talkies. It is still very much an early Warner's talkie. It's a Warner's PreCode film, but because you've got Roy Del Ruth behind the camera, and he was really behind some of James Cagney's best Warner vehicles, the film has a snappiness. It has an energy. It has a sense of movement. It doesn't feel stagnant. It's not an early talkie where the camera is very much locked to a central position and everybody is gathered around a central area for a microphone. There are some surprising dynamic camera angles mixed in. There's not enough of them, but there's enough of them for it to make the film feel more vibrant. So this is a really good early Warner's PreCode talkie. It's got some snappiness to it. It has that Warner energy. You could even picture Cagney playing this version of Spade if you wanted to, and it would actually fit. But it's surprising how much of Hammett's novel is here. It's just too diluted is the problem. So while you're getting all the story beats and you've got the characters of the Maltese Falcon, it never feels like the Maltese Falcon. It feels like an echo of it. I think the best way to describe it is almost if you look at radio adaptations of classic novels and films, particularly of the Maltese Falcon, they obviously had to abridge story elements for time, especially cramming it down to under 30 minutes. And so it's fascinating to see what radio writers would do to cut out big blocks of time and have to mix in exposition or mash down multiple scenes into a single scene. So in that sense, this film is sort of reminiscent of a radio adaptation of a novel where it's doing all the same story beats, but it's abridged or it's diluted, which of course means it doesn't have the same full effect as the original work. or because there is a lived-in quality, there's a grittiness to it. You could maybe link this to looking at the pre-release version of the Howard Hawks version of The Big Sleep, the 1945 version, if you will, where it does a little bit more of Chandler's novel directly, and so we see a bit more of the sort of procedural side, and it doesn't have the reshoot material with all the iconic Bogart and Bacall conversations that amp up the sort of iconic status of the 1946 film we know and adore, which isn't really Chandler's novel, but it's also doing Chandler's novel and giving it a whole new breath of life. So I think you could also tie the 1931 Maltese Falcon to the 1946 Big Sleep, in that what Howard Hawks was doing in that film adaptation is sort of like the ultimate version of what the 1931 Maltese Falcon is doing with Hammett's source novel. It's not quite as fully polished and hitting the same artistic heights that Hawks would do in 1946, even though he's doing Chandler, and Chandler is totally different to Hammett, even though they're from the same school. They're basically the two giant names of hard-boiled fiction, but they have so many similarities that Chandler was always very much deferential to Hammett as the sort of originator of the hard-boiled school. But I think it's fascinating to look at that sort of parallel and recognize that perhaps the 1931 Maltese Falcon, in terms of all the PreCode trappings and it being adapted at this point in 1931, and what it does with Hammett's novel, is sort of the forerunner to what we see Howard Hawks doing in 1946, ultimately with his version of Chandler's The Big Sleep. So I do think there's a parallel there. And of course, I look at all this stuff way too much because I'm a noir geek and I love this stuff too much. But I just always am fascinated by so many elements coming back to the 1931 version of the Maltese Falcon. So I would recommend it to anyone. And it's very wonderful. We have the ability to even look at it, even though it has never been restored, and obviously the video master we have is from a very worn print element. It would be really something if these two earlier film versions could get cleaned up a little bit and included on further releases of the 1941 version. But unfortunately, all we really have is the 2006 DVD presentation on the full deluxe 3-disc edition of the Maltese Falcon. Now, all of the other extras for the Falcon that were made at this time have been ported to the Blu-ray and the UHD, but unfortunately, some numbskull at Warner decided the previous 2 film versions were not important to include as well, so they remain exclusive to the second disc of the 3-disc special edition DVD, and so that's how I view these films, and that's really your best and only option outside of the very rare, perhaps TCM airing. Now, in terms of the presentation of the 1931 version, it is a obviously standard def transfer. It's a 2006 Warner DVD. So, of course, this is a master probably done years and years ago. The element is extremely worn and damaged. It's a 1931 early talkie, so you do have to expect that. It's also got the window boxed opening credits that Warner would typically do on DVD at this time, so you have to expect that as well. But overall, it's relatively solid. The presentation is still perfectly watchable, and it's amazing to have the option to even be able to look at these, because these have not had much of a video release before this. They have not had anything afterwards, because unfortunately the previous film versions were dropped from later releases, and they weren't even ported over in these old standard def presentations. So it was commendable of Warner to, at this time, include them on the DVD release, and at least give a slightly spiffed up video master that is very much a preservation master. So you do need to expect all kinds of damage, frame jumps, everything, and of course some obvious noise in the soundtrack, because this is an early talkie, and this film has never been restored or anything, and the elements have got to be extremely compromised. So we're lucky to have even a good complete source that survives, and obviously the quality is what it is on this old 2006 DVD presentation, but it's a nice inclusion and really should be ported over to all subsequent releases of the 1941 film, and unfortunately haven't due to some stupid decisions by Warner. So let's stop talking about the Blackbird and instead talk about the horn that everybody's searching for in 1936's Satan Met a Lady. This is the bizarro film version of the Maltese Falcon, the one that has the terrible reputation because it's it's a comedy, but it's also still doing the Maltese Falcon, even though all the names have been pretty much changed. And Warren William is now our lead detective, and his very unique, particular style that he's iconic and known for in throughout 1930s and 40s films and screwball comedies. So this is a very bizarre treatment of Hammett's masterpiece by Warner, but it's also fitting into the types of comedy films they were making at this time in 1936, with the production code in full swing, which meant you couldn't do what they did in 1931. And in fact, they couldn't even reissue the 1931 version because the production code basically said, hell no, you're not going to reissue this. Or you'd have to literally cut 90% of it out. And so it's said that perhaps this is why Warner decided to just remake the film. But most studios remade films, even big successful ones, after a number of years anyway, sometimes very thinly disguised, or disguised enough that they would think audiences wouldn't recognize the fact that they saw this same story 5 years ago, but it wasn't a comedy. So that's not uncommon to studio era films. And if you look at films closely, even films that aren't highlighted for being remakes, you can obviously recognize sometimes it's 3 or 4 films being mashed together from the past 5 or 10 years. If you recognize certain elements, you're like, oh wait, this is this mashed with this, and that was a common practice at the time. Well, Saint Metal Lady is obviously a remake because they even, used Hammett's name in the marketing in terms of trying to sell it. As always, they would market it as from the author of The Thin Man because of the great success of the Thin Man film series that had already started. But of course, over at MGM, that was their sort of name recognition, hoping for audiences to come in. And I think also The Thin Man was the impetus for going into the comedy side of things with this film, because when they made the 1931 version, there was no landmark Thin Man series that had started, which took a more screwball comedy approach to Hammett's Thin Man novel, which was much more straightforward and didn't have the same delirious wonderful heights of the films that we love and adore. So I think that has to be looked at in terms of feeding into why suddenly Warner decided to turn the Maltese Falcon into a comedy. Now, again, the film has a terrible reputation. That's very obvious. And when you actually sit down and watch this the first time, it is rough going. It's frequently labeled as not really doing the book at all and just being a dumb comedy and being a total misfire. Yes, it's a misfire. And at first, it seems like it's just making stuff up with only the barest resemblance to Hammett's original plot. But after the first 5 to 10 minutes, you can actually see Hammett's plot start to trickle in. Basically, we have the whole opening sequence, but then we get into the detective office with the partner and Effie the secretary, and then we have the mysterious woman played by Betty Davis, who did not want to make this film at all, and Warner basically made her do it, and she regarded it as terrible. But she's actually quite good in the film. But then again, she was great in everything she ever did because she was Betty Davis. So after a little bit of time, you can recognize Maltese Falcon elements coming in, and then we have the killing of the partner, and then we have the villains come in, except it's a little bit different here because all the villains are also inherently being played for comedy, and the names have changed around. So every character pretty much has a different name for the most part, and that of course confuses things further when we know the story, and then you have to remember which character was named what in which version. The 1931 version keeps most of the names the same. There's a little bit of difference, like for example, randomly Cairo in the 1931 film is a doctor for whatever reason. But here in the 36 version, every character is different, and they're being played for laughs, but then there's also moments of seriousness where all the jokes drop out. So what really makes this film a misfire is not that it's a comedy, it's the fact that it wants to have it both ways. It wants to continually be a comedy and be a screwball and have Warren Williams just being his usual dapper, charming, amazing self, but then it wants to flip over and do Hammett. So it's so bizarre that the tone is loony. That's the best way to describe it. This has a loony wackiness to it, in a bad way in terms of it's constantly undercutting itself, and you can't get a reading on what kind of film it is. If it was just a straight screwball version of the story, I'd actually have no problem with it, and I think it would have a better reputation. If it was a straight drama that was playing more for the laugh side of things, same case. I think it would be better reviewed, and I think it would have been more successful. And had either of those things happened, it would have been more unlikely that we get the masterpiece version in 1941, because the 1936 film would be more in people's heads because it would have been more successful. But because it doesn't do either of those, it doesn't commit more to either tone, and it has this constant sort of jostling of the tones that it really truly is a misfire. If you ever needed a film to define the term cinematic misfire, Satan Metal Lady is your answer. Is it absolutely terrible? No, but it's so disjointed and so frustrating, especially when you know the Maltese Falcon like the back of your hand, and you love the 1941 film, and you've just seen the 1931 version, that this film will really infuriate you. And even though it's shorter than the 1931 version, this film is only 74 minutes. It feels so much longer because it's quite baffling in departures it makes from the source novel. And then we go into completely different events for a long while, but then we snap back to Hammett material, and then we suddenly get introduced to the Gutman figure of this story, except now it's reinvented as this rather charming, duplicitous, legendary criminal who is this rich old woman. And then she starts doing the iconic Gutman speech to Spade, except Spade is now in the guise of Warren William, and then he'll occasionally be giving Hammett's dialogue. So we actually have some of Hammett's dialogue in this film, almost word for word. We even get the iconic dialogue from Gutman about distrusting a man who says when, and even iconic lines of Spade's pop up here. And we even get a version of Hammett's ending. It's different, it's played differently, but the core of it is still Hammett. So even that, coming after all of the wackiness of the film leading up to it, all of the core of the story still being there, and this constant snapping back and forth, the film is a mess. And it feels longer than it is because it drags, even though it's got some great gags and some great one-liners, some nice bits of comedy, and Warren Williams literally has to carry the film forward. I mean, it still drags, which is quite bizarre. It's one of those films that honestly is actually better if you look at it in individual scenes. If you looked at a particular little clip of this film, you'll probably chuckle more in isolation from the rest of it, because the whole film kind of just goes along like a freight train, and you just either have to get on board with it and you're just in for the ride, or you're going to get run over, because it's just a bizarre film to even describe, let alone process, because again, the comedy side and the trying to do Hammett side, they are not meshed. They just bang together, and it's very disjointed and disorienting. And that's why the film deserves its poor reputation. But it's not as bad as people would have you think. And it also has more of Hammett in there, because the overall reputation is that the film is terrible and it's a comedy and it doesn't do the Maltese Falcon. Well, you still have a detective with his partner killed and a duplicitous woman who's not telling everything, and other characters come in who are other villains of the story, and they're all after a priceless artifact that is missing and has been disguised over the years and has a great amount of jewels and gold and riches tied to it. So, the story is still there. Of course, it's no longer a Maltese Falcon. They're no longer after the black bird. They're after a jewel-stuffed horn, which is a bizarre twist. I don't know why it was necessary to change one of the most iconic MacGuffins in all of fiction, and one of the most iconic props or visual elements in all of films, but they did. So that does also make this particular film unique because it's no longer a bird they're going after. And I think the reason why they made it a horn is made very clear because it's entirely to set up a joke at the end of the film, which is in the climax and the emotional climax, which suddenly does Hammett's ending out of nowhere. So, and even when we get Hammett's ending at the end of this film, which is a scene that actually starts with comedy and then suddenly goes into Hammett's ending where all the comedy gets dropped out and you see Warren Williams and Bette Davis actually playing Hammett's ending between Spade and Bridget, even though the characters have different names and Warren Williams been wearing a cowboy hat the whole film instead of a fedora. All the jokiness drops out and they actually play that scene, and suddenly you realize, holy crap, this is Hammett's ending. And they're actually playing it well, and it just comes out of nowhere. Well, then suddenly the very end of the film goes back into jokey humor, wackiness, fast-talking screwball dialogue, and that just pulls the rug out from under you for like the 5th time in the last scene of the film. And that is a microcosm of all of Satan Metal Lady, which is a bizarre experience. It doesn't work, but it has energy in spots, and it has levity, and it has humor, and it has Hammett's novel, even though it is so badly watered down and torn up and moved all around and undercut for laughs. It's a bizarre film. It's so bizarre that you can't quite say it's bad or terrible because there's good stuff in there, but it's so bizarre you can't quite process it. It's one of those films that you watch it and it's kind of like a train wreck. Not in the it's a train wreck, it's the worst thing ever. It's like a train wreck in terms of it's a hot mess. This is the cinematic definition of a hot mess. That's the best way to describe Satan Metal Lady. And it's even more baffling because this film was directed by William Dieterle, who is a good director and a very notable name. And to have yet another connection to the 1941 version, this was shot by the legendary Arthur Edison, who also shot the 1941 version. So he gets the first sort of experience with the story, I guess, here in 1936, even though it's completely different in tone and doesn't have the visual sense of the 1941 version. But I think having this experience with the same story the first time around being so bastardized that it gives maybe Edison some sort of background in the Maltese Falcon to then bring to the 1941 version in his astounding collaboration with John Huston, and ultimately they produce one of the most visually stunning and most intricately designed films of all time, and it really does rival Citizen Kane in certain aspects because it does have many similarities on a visual level, right down to having visible ceilings and different camera angles. And of course, none of this was intentional, but you can actually see how Orson Welles being teamed with Greg Toland were working along similar lines to John Huston, his first time out, being teamed with Arthur Edison. So that's part of why you have this linkage forever between Citizen Kane and the Maltese Falcon in 1941. They have a lot of similar themes and a lot of techniques that they share. I guess maybe it was something in the water at the time that they were all drinking from. But and of course, Welles and Huston became lifelong friends, but they had a lot of similar ideas and themes in their work. So I think it's natural that their first time out as a director, they were partnered with legendary cinematographers and had such a synergistic relationship that I think that's why you see so many parallels between the Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane. But looking at what Arthur Edison has to do here in a Warner's programmer comedy version of the Maltese Falcon 5 years ahead of time, it does make for an interesting parallel. And I think anybody working on this film might have been a little frustrated at just how dumb this movie was, and maybe that gave them a little extra gumption to really try and perfect the next time in 1941. As I said before, they do pull some things from the 1931 adaptation in terms of some story elements. We do see the partner knowing about his wife and the Spade character's relationship and expressing jealousy before he's no longer in the film. And then we also have a repeat of the same element of the 1931 version, where the police sort of gang up on Spade in that film, and towards the end, and basically give him 24 hours to wrap everything up or they'll arrest him. Well, you have that repeated here with the sort of city fathers or elder council of the city coming to the Warren William character and basically sort of saying the same thing. So there are echoes of the changes made in 1931 in the 1936 film. So it seems very obvious that what they did was take the 1931 script and take that and refashion it as this weird comedy vehicle instead of going back to Hammett's novel and doing it straight, which is what John Huston would do in 1941. And because the 1931 film was relatively close to Hammett, including a lot of his dialogue, that's why you see that reflected in the 1936 film, because they were basically reworking and rewriting the 1931 script and taking out all the PreCode elements and instead upping that sort of jokey tone that popped up in the 1931 version and making it take over and run away with the film. And there is a quirkiness here. There are enjoyable moments. Yes, it's nice to have Joel Cairo recast as this very upper crust, proper Englishman who will ransack a place and pull a gun on you, but then apologize for it because he's so polite. And then when things don't go his way, gets to say the stereotypical wonderful line, "That's not very cricket." So there is some whimsy here, and there are enjoyable moments, but it's not going to be a film you're going to return to all that much, except for studying just how much of a hot mess that it is. And thankfully, there is this quirkiness and there is some levity to enjoy, because without the enjoyable humor, there would be nothing to come back to this film for. So again, it's a cinematic curiosity and it should be studied, but it's also just a complete misfire, a total mess. And it may have been made worse because apparently Warner's was confused by the rough cut, so they had re-edits made. And I think that may play into why the film feels so jumbled, because it does feel jumbled. It feels jumbled to the point of even I, having seen this film before and being a gigantic Falcon fan and knowing all the other versions, I get confused by some of the stuff going on here and the way some of the scenes are handled and the way some of the editing is. So I am very much convinced this was re-edited by somebody else. I do think that that anecdote is true, and I think that's reflected in the film. And I think that's also why it feels so weird and it drags along, even though it's got pockets of energy. So I think even the editing suffers in terms of just being just loony and a mess. Now, Saint Middle Lady is also included on the same disc 2 of this DVD set from the 2006 release of the Maltese Falcon. Like the 1931 version, this is an old standard def master, and it is full of damage. Honestly, it's just as much damage as you see in the 1931 version. And while the 31 version did have one spot of displaying changeover cues from a print source, Saint Middle Lady is literally scanned from a print because it has all of the changeover cues throughout the film, and it is significantly damaged. It's still perfectly watchable, but do keep in mind this is a very rough element they had to transfer. There's been no work done on it, and who knows when the masters for both of these films were made in terms of the video era, but thankfully they were included here, and you can watch both of them. And the audio is filled with damage as well. It's just obviously a newer film than the 1931 version, so the source recording itself is improved in terms of the technology and the era, but the audio is just as damaged as the picture in terms of inherent source defects. So do keep in mind this is a very rough looking element. It is a direct print transfer because you've even got all of the real changeover cues. It has not been cleaned up at all, but at least you do have a solid way to watch both versions, and they're both on the same disc. We do actually have the original trailer for Saint Metal Lady. Apparently the 1931 trailer doesn't survive, but Warner did include the trailer for the 1936 film here, and you can see how they were trying to really sell this as very much obviously a comedy, really hyping up the stars, particularly Bette Davis, even though she's actually not in the film all that much. And you can tell in every scene, although she plays it to the hilt, you know that she hated making this and didn't want to do it. And I think anybody would probably feel the same way. But she does bring a good necessary energy to the film. But they really tried to sell it as a Betty Davis vehicle, and then they use Hammett in terms of trying to hype him up. And honestly, they used the same credit tagline that the 1941 trailer does in terms of hyping Hammett as author of The Thin Man. But at least we do have the trailer here. Now, in the 2006 DVD set, it was 2 slim cases, and we actually have artwork for the previous versions on the second slim case. And this also has the third disc, which has the little featurette documentary and extras. We also got a nice custom label for all of the discs in this set. And again, this remains the only major video release of the 2 previous versions. Now, after this point, Warner Brothers would replicate all of the disc 1 and disc 3 extras for the 1941 version. They're just ported over and over, but they skipped the 2 previous adaptations. So basically, disc 2 of this set is still exclusive to the 2006 special edition of the 1941 film. Another note, this same exact set was included in the Humphrey Bogart Signature Collection DVD sets when they made 2 different volumes. But unfortunately, that is affected by the Warner DVD rot problem, which usually doesn't affect standalone copies. So I remember I purchased this release literally the day it came out at Target when I was a teenager, because I was already a classic film nerd, of course, and a Falcon nut, but I just didn't have the money for the full box set. And now I'm very glad that I purchased this instead of the box set, because this suffers no rot issues, and I just watched the 2 films on disc 2 without any problems. But I do know that copies and the signature volumes can be affected by rot. So if you do have the signature box set version, you might want to check your discs in there just to make sure that they play accurately, because unfortunately the Warner DVD rot problem is quite widespread and particularly seems to affect the classic film box sets. So overall, those are my thoughts on the 2 previous versions of the Maltese Falcon in terms of the Warner film adaptations and their only real release on home video. I just thought it was important to discuss these because while people may know about them or have heard of them nowadays, it's very rare that they've actually gone and seen them. So they remain cinematic obscurities and curiosities. But if you're a fan of the 1941 film and you're a fan of Hammett, or you're a noir geek, these are really essential studies to look at how what is, I think, one of the greatest novels ever written was first translated to the cinematic medium. And looking at these 2 films really underlines the genius of the 1941 film version and why it is not only a masterpiece for the ages, but really is the definitive version of Hammett's story. And also even some of the tweaks and changes it made to Hammett's prose. It does almost transcribe Hammett's novel word for word, but it makes some alterations for the production code, but also some select little changes that John Huston made in the scripting process that, as I said before, it makes the characters more mythic. And that was something that you didn't quite get fully even in Hammett's original novel. And some of that may be the fact that he was adapting it 11 years later and also the production code, but it is a distinct difference. And I think looking at these 2 films will underline the unique qualities of the 1941 version. And it's important to study all of them to understand the full adaptation process and also how the novel worked its way through Warner Brothers in the 1930s. So as always, I hope my babblings about the Blackbird and classic films and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do check out the 1931 and 1936 films. They are really fascinating, and while your mileage may vary with how much you enjoy them, I really loved being able to come back to them again and look at them back to back and then make my comparisons to the 1941 version and really recognize how much of Hammett made it into the 30s films. I would love to see these films get a new scan someday. Yes, they're obscure, but they would make one heck of a Warner Archive double feature Blu-ray release. I think it's absolutely criminal that they were removed from the Blu-ray and UHD releases and remain exclusive to the 2006 DVD set, which some copies, as I alluded to before, are affected by disc rot. So do check your copies if you have the box set version. But even if they were just going to port these old standard def copies, they should have been included in the later releases because everything else was carried over, including the Satan Metal Lady trailer. So I don't know why that was done, but they should be ported over. They should be on the UHD release as well. They're not. So you do have to have the 2006 DVD for being a Falcon completist and being a PreCode Hollywood fan. And these are fascinating films, and I think very much worth the time. And they're not particularly long. They're both around 75 minutes, so you can watch both of them in one night if you wanted to, and see just the disparity of the difference between what the same studio could do with the same story in just 5 short years, because they are so completely different from one another. But you still recognize the core of Hammett in there, however disguised it may be. It's still there. So, as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.